If Iran falls, the entire Middle East chessboard gets flipped, and two superpowers are already positioning for what comes next. Right now, beneath the headlines about sanctions, nuclear negotiations, and regional tensions, a critical question is quietly being analyzed in Washington, Beijing, and capitals across the globe. What happens if Iran's government collapses? It's not hypothetical anymore. Iran is facing converging pressures that would destabilize any nation, crushing economic sanctions that have devastated the currency and triggered inflation. Widespread protests that have evolved from economic grievances into fundamental challenges to the regime's legitimacy. A young population increasingly disconnected from the revolutionary ideology that founded the Islamic Republic, and regional isolation as former allies reassess their relationships. The signs of instability are real. The question isn't whether Iran faces serious challenges. The question is, what happens if those challenges become overwhelming? Because if Iran's government falls or fragments, the geopolitical consequences would be immediate, massive, and global. And the two nations watching most carefully, planning most intensively, and positioned to gain or lose the most are the United States and China. So today, we're breaking down what an Iran collapse would actually mean. Not speculation, not worst-case fantasy scenarios, but the strategic realities that American and Chinese policymakers are gaming out right now in classified briefings and strategic planning sessions. What each superpower stands to gain, what each stands to lose, and why the future of Iran might determine the balance of power across the entire Middle East and beyond. What collapse actually means, or let's be precise about what we're discussing. When analysts talk about Iran collapsing, they're not necessarily describing a Hollywood-style revolution where the government falls overnight and democracy immediately emerges. Collapse could take multiple forms. Regime fragmentation, where competing power centers, the Revolutionary Guard, reformist politicians, regional governors, fracture into rival factions unable to maintain unified control. Economic implosion severe enough that the government loses its ability to provide basic services, pay security forces, or maintain order, leading to ungoverned spaces and regional breakaway movements. Revolutionary uprising, where sustained protests overwhelm security forces and force fundamental political transformation, similar to what happened in 1979, but in reverse. Military coup, where elements of Iran's armed forces decide the civilian leadership has become untenable and seize control to stabilize the situation. Controlled transition, where internal reformers or external pressure forces gradual political opening and economic restructuring under international supervision. Each scenario produces different outcomes, but all share one critical characteristic. They fundamentally reshape the strategic landscape of the Middle East in ways that directly impact both American and Chinese interests. What the United States stands to gain. From Washington's perspective, an Iran collapse or fundamental transformation could deliver strategic benefits that have eluded American policymakers for over 4 decades. Elimination of a primary regional adversary. Since 1979, Iran has been the United States' most persistent opponent in the Middle East. Iran has supported proxy forces across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza. It has challenged U.S. military presence in the Gulf. It has pursued nuclear capabilities that threaten American allies. And it has actively worked to reduce American influence across the region. If Iran's government collapses, that opposition disappears or becomes dramatically weakened. Proxy networks lose funding and coordination. Regional militant groups lose their most reliable sponsor. And the united anti-American coalition fragments. Enhanced security for key allies. Israel and Gulf Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, would see their primary security threat significantly reduced. Iran's ballistic missile programs, drone capabilities, and support for groups like Hezbollah and Hamas represent existential concerns for these American partners. A collapsed or transformed Iran means these allies face a fundamentally different threat environment, potentially allowing for broader normalization of relations and stronger regional security cooperation. Resolution of the nuclear question. Iran's nuclear program has been the subject of decades of negotiations, sanctions, and international pressure. A government collapse could provide opportunities to permanently address this issue through international oversight, dismantlement programs, or political transformation that makes nuclear weapons pursuit unnecessary or impossible. Energy market stabilization. Iran possesses massive oil and natural gas reserves. Currently, sanctions keep much of this production offline or limited. A post-collapse Iran that integrates into global markets could add significant supply, potentially stabilizing prices and reducing leverage that rival producers currently enjoy. Reduction of Chinese and Russian influence. Iran has become increasingly aligned with China and Russia as Western pressure intensified. A collapse disrupts those partnerships and potentially removes a key node in the emerging anti-Western coalition that Beijing and Moscow are cultivating. What the United States stands to lose. But collapse scenarios also carry significant risks for American interests that Washington must carefully consider. Regional chaos and ungoverned spaces. If Iran fragments or descends into civil conflict, it creates ungoverned territories where terrorist organizations can establish safe havens. ISIS and Al-Qaeda have exploited similar power vacuums in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan. An unstable Iran covering a territory larger than Iraq, Syria, and Libya combined would be exponentially more dangerous. Refugee crisis. Iran has a population of approximately 85 million people. Even partial state failure could trigger refugee flows that dwarf the Syrian crisis, destabilizing neighboring Turkey, Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, while creating humanitarian emergencies that demand international response. Nuclear material security. In a collapse scenario, who controls Iran's nuclear facilities, research programs, and potentially weapons-grade material? The risk of proliferation, theft, or loss of control over sensitive nuclear technology is extremely high and represents a nightmare scenario for non-proliferation efforts. Sectarian conflict escalation. Iran is majority Shia in a predominantly Sunni region. Government collapse could trigger broader Sunni-Shia violence across the Middle East, pulling in regional powers and potentially leading to wider conflicts that demand American military intervention to prevent humanitarian catastrophe. Costly stabilization requirements. The United States has direct experience with the enormous costs of trying to stabilize failed or failing states in the Middle East. Iraq and Afghanistan consumed trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives. Iran is larger, more populous, and more strategically complex than either. Washington may find itself pressured into stabilization efforts it cannot afford, and the public will not support. What China stands to gain. For Beijing, an Iran collapse presents a fundamentally different set of opportunities and challenges than what Washington faces. Economic access to energy resources. China is the world's largest energy importer and has been Iran's biggest oil customer despite international sanctions. A post-collapse Iran that opens to international investment could provide Chinese companies with unprecedented access to some of the world's largest oil and gas reserves. Unlike Western companies that face political and legal constraints, Chinese state-owned enterprises could move quickly to secure long-term energy contracts, infrastructure projects, and resource extraction rights. Belt and Road expansion. Iran sits at a critical geographic crossroads connecting the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia. It's essential for China's Belt and Road Initiative vision of Eurasian connectivity. A friendly or neutral post-collapse Iran allows for railway development, port access, particularly Chabahar Port, and transportation corridors that fundamentally reshape Asian trade routes in ways that benefit Chinese commerce and reduce dependence on maritime choke points controlled by the U.S. Navy. Strategic depth. Against U.S. encirclement. China views American military presence in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Pacific as a containment strategy. Iran has been a useful partner in complicating American freedom of action in the region. If China can establish strong relationships with whatever government emerges post-collapse, it maintains strategic depth and denies Washington complete dominance in a critical region. Reduced American focus on Asia. If Iran collapses and requires significant American attention and resources for stabilization or management, that necessarily diverts focus from the Indo-Pacific. Every dollar, diplomatic effort, and military asset the U.S. commits to the Middle East is one not available for competition with China in Asia. What China stands to lose. But Beijing also faces serious risks if Iran becomes unstable or shifts away from its current alignment. Loss of a strategic partner. Current Iran provides China with a valuable partner that challenges American interests, complicates Western coalition building, and provides economic opportunities that Western companies cannot pursue due to sanctions. A post-collapse Iran that aligns with the West or becomes neutral eliminates these benefits and potentially creates another front where China faces opposition rather than partnership. Instability on China's western periphery. China shares concerns about regional stability. Chaos in Iran could destabilize Afghanistan, where China has mining interests, Pakistan, a key Belt and Road partner, and Central Asian states where China has invested heavily. Refugee flows, terrorism spillover, and economic disruption would directly threaten Chinese interests and require expensive security responses. Energy supply disruption. Even though China could benefit long-term from access to Iranian resources, short-term collapse scenarios would disrupt oil and gas supplies that Chinese industry depends on. Market volatility and supply interruptions create economic vulnerabilities that Beijing works hard to avoid. Exposure of Belt and Road vulnerabilities. China has invested billions in Iranian infrastructure projects. State collapse would likely result in asset losses, project cancellations, and demonstrated proof that Belt and Road investments in politically unstable countries carry enormous risks. This undermines Beijing's narrative about the reliability and wisdom of its development model. Forced choice between principles and pragmatism. China officially champions sovereignty and non-interference. An Iran collapse, particularly if driven by Western pressure or intervention, would force Beijing to choose between supporting its stated principles, backing Iran's government, or pursuing its pragmatic interests, engaging with whatever emerges next. Either choice carries costs to China's international credibility and relationships. The great power competition. Dimension. Here's what makes this scenario particularly complex. The United States and China aren't operating in isolation. How each responds to Iran's potential instability will be shaped by competition with the other. If the U.S. sees China moving to fill a vacuum, American policymakers will feel pressure to act more aggressively to prevent Chinese gains. If China sees the U.S. trying to install a friendly government, Beijing will work to complicate those efforts and support alternatives that preserve Chinese access and influence. This creates escalation risks, where neither superpower particularly wants deep involvement, but both feel compelled to act to prevent the other from gaining advantage. It's the classic security dilemma playing out in real time with an unstable nuclear threshold state as the prize. What this means for the region and the world. An Iran collapse wouldn't just affect Tehran, Washington, and Beijing. Regional powers like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Russia would all pursue their own interests aggressively, potentially leading to proxy conflicts or direct interventions. Energy markets would face enormous volatility as Iran's production comes offline during instability, and market participants speculate about future supply scenarios. Global terrorism concerns would intensify if ungoverned spaces emerge where extremist groups can operate freely. Nuclear proliferation risks would spike as regional powers reassess their security needs in a post-Iran environment. International institutions would face tests of their ability to manage humanitarian crises, coordinate stabilization efforts, and prevent wider conflict. In other words, Iran's stability or instability has global systemic implications that extend far beyond any bilateral US-China competition. The bottom line. Here's what you need to understand. Iran's potential collapse represents one of the most significant geopolitical wildcards currently in play. Both the United States and China have compelling interests in how this scenario unfolds, but neither has a clear playbook that guarantees positive outcomes. Washington could see a primary adversary eliminated, but faces enormous costs and risks if it gets drawn into stabilization efforts. Beijing could gain energy access and strategic depth, but risks losing a valuable partner and inheriting instability on its periphery. And the world could see either a pathway toward Middle East transformation and stability, or a descent into chaos that makes the past 2 decades of regional conflict look manageable by comparison. What's happening? Why it matters? What comes next? That's our mission, helping you understand not just today's headlines, but the strategic dynamics that will shape tomorrow's world. Because understanding what an Iran collapse would mean isn't just about the Middle East. It's about understanding how great power competition works when the stakes couldn't be higher.